Tainted Liberation =RK equals Part 1 =RK equals Coronet City, Corellia. After 2 years of fighting and commanding armies, Obi-Wan thought that he knew war. He believed he had seen slaughter in ways he could have never previously imagined. Now, he was ready to sell himself to the dark side to make it so. Kenobi was on top of a heavy DAS tank. He held for dear life as the machine rumbled under his feet and drove through dense smoke over shattered streets. The sound of combat was deafening, a never-ending crescendo of explosions and rapid fire. Missiles howled like damned souls, carried forward on wings of fire. Laser and particle beams cut like spears through the smoke, while red and angry, blaster bolts rained in all directions. Below all that noise, came the constant agonized screams of dying soldiers thumping against Obi-Wan's mind. The dead and dying clawed at his sanity, while the cold embrace of the dark side closed around him. There was no escaping the poisonous knowledge that he approved of this plan. Obi-Wan ordered it, and now everyone was reaping the consequences. The tank lurched sharply, its driver revving up the engine, and they plunged into the glowing wall of the enemy theater shield. As soon as the front of the tank crossed, small tubes attached to its chassis popped up, sending 8 smoke canisters spinning through the air. They vanished almost immediately, adding to the concealing haze clinging to everything. More tanks, walkers, and support vehicles drove behind them, while a constant stream of infantry poured into the breach. All Obi-Wan could see with his eyes were vague shapes, illuminated by fires. Tanks and IFVs lined the road, pushed away to make space. Through the Force, everything looked much different. Kenobi could perceive dead and dying, small clusters of wounded attended by medics and waiting for evacuation, fallen soldiers, and what might be pieces of others. Then there were the dead, unceremoniously piled up beside burning vehicles for later identification and processing. The first 2 echelons Kenobi sent into the meat grinder were combat ineffective now, with the first broken and nearly destroyed. The last elements of the second held a perimeter allowing for safe deployment of reinforcements through the shield, even though they were under heavy assault. Infantry companies ran by the side of the boulevard, fanning to the left and right to reinforce the units holding the flanks. Meanwhile, the heavy elements of the third echelon raced through, and all too soon, reached the point of contact. The smoke was less dense here. Compared to the thick silver wall dropped between the 2 theater shields, it was little more than thin mist. It was still good enough to degrade long-range targeting, especially when combined with the best ECM the GAR could place on ground vehicles. Finally, Obi-Wan could properly see the battlefield, and he immediately wished that the smoke was denser. Kenobi could see hundreds of bodies. Soldiers in charred, melted armor, laid everywhere. Others were little more than humanoid-shaped lumps melted into vehicles they couldn't escape from or used for cover when struck. At the front, where the fighting was fiercest, 3 DAS tanks used a burning barricade for cover. The surviving tanks had pushed no less than 30 destroyed Republic vehicles to form a simple barrier. Behind the tanks, walkers stood over heaps of rubble, all that remained from demolished and melted facades of skyscrapers. A few smaller buildings were even less fortunate, turned into little more than smoking piles of rubble with soldiers and machines crawling all over them. Here and there, damaged IFVs and APCs stood out, surrounded by clusters of infantry. More armored soldiers crawled all over the place, searching for any dubious cover they could find. If it wasn't for their new shielded armor, Obi-Wan doubted that any of them would be still alive. Down street, hell awaited them all. Upgraded separatist tanks advanced towards their positions, covered in dark, sloped armor and bristling with weapons. At least a dozen tri-droids towered above them, providing fire support with missiles and laser cannons. As if that wasn't bad enough, Obi-Wan could see a tremendous amount of firepower falling upon the remnants of the second echelon, coming down from practically every building past the barricade. Heavy missiles howled overhead. A few of them took a sharp dive and dispensed hissing smoke canisters, quickly cutting down the line of sight. The others went forward, facing desperate defensive fire from the droids. Shortly before reaching the enemy lines, the missiles disintegrated, raining sub-munitions all over the street. Before the smoke cut down visibility, Obi-Wan could see bright explosions and the telltale purple glow of ionic radiation. More missiles roared overhead. This time, they were much smaller. While Obi-Wan's tank took position beside the three holding the barricade, the missiles struck. The explosions lit up the silver smoke, scattered some of it before it rushed back as if sucked in by a hard vacuum. For a brief moment, Obi-Wan saw blossoming explosions, and a few implosions crawl up and down the facades of multiple buildings before the smoke fell back in place. A heavy six-wheeled ground truck came to a screeching halt behind the tanks on point, nearly colliding with the cheerfully burning melted remains of identical vehicles. Its back split open, revealing a powered-up shield emitter. Multicolored energy streamed up from it. It twisted like a vortex, before splitting up to form a 10 meters tall dome. The shield soon spread to surround the forward GAR position. Blaster bolts, laser strikes, and missiles impacted the shield, unleashing their fury on its surface, yet it held for now. Obi-Wan still waited, while his third echelon kept pouring into the breach. Tanks, followed by wheeled IFEs, split in two, driving around the barricade. Walkers followed up in sedate pace, while more missiles howled overhead. A squadron of vultures screamed from above, descending over the boulevard. Missiles and rapid-fire laser cannons from air defense vehicles rose to meet them. The tactical shield managed to survive the droid fighters' onslaught, if barely. However, they didn't break off, and despite suffering punishing casualties, they kept going, doing their best to strafe the clustered GAR units. The deflectors of the heavy tanks in the column helped absorb the brunt of the attack, however, they couldn't stop it. Here and there, the odd laser bolt struck, vaporizing infantry, or carving through a vehicle, and turning it into a burning coffin. The following machines simply pushed the destroyed ones aside, to join the long procession of blazing metal coffins lining up the boulevard. Dagger actual to all dagger elements, Kenobi spoke for the first time since the assault began. Advance. From this point on, it wasn't going to be a race, but a slow, ponderous siege. Heavy shielded tanks led the way, methodically demolishing the buildings surrounding their way to the heart of Coronet. IFEs provided support with rapid-fire heavy repeater blasters and turret-mounted E-webs, while clusters of infantry advanced behind them to keep droids from interfering. More and more missiles streaked above the GAR forces, unleashing their fury down the length of the boulevard. Meanwhile, Obi-Wan gathered the force around his body, until the air shimmered with power. He waited, observing the enemy through it, and thrust his hands forward when the time was right. A column of Hellfire tanks advanced towards the breach. From what little Kenobi could observe through the Force, there was little noticeable modification to the design. They were fast, fragile, and able to unleash a deadly hail of missiles, before retreating to rearm. The 10-odd-looking machines unleashed a barrage of 300 missiles at the GAR positions, explaining how they overwhelmed the tactical shields of the first and second echelon. The missiles streaked above the boulevard like a cloud of arrows, that wouldn't be out of place on an ancient battlefield. They briefly rose, before plunging at a steep angle towards the Republic armor. Instead of raining death upon the Republic soldiers, the missile salvo halted in its tracks, stopped cold by Obi-Wan's telekinesis. Their rocket motors howled, straining to push through the impossible resistance. It was futile. Obi-Wan ground his teeth, drawing more and more power, then pushed forward, throwing the missiles away. They tumbled through the air, flying in all directions. Another push ensured that the few that still streaked toward the GAR positions would fly away. Moments later, 300 explosions rippled all over the enemy positions. The third echelon kept a slow and steady advance, prompted more by the need to spread out and the push of incoming reinforcements, than the desire to charge into the teeth of the enemy defenses. Instead, the GAR units were keen on maintaining a long-range duel, until they could shatter the heavy defense positions facing them. The need to neutralize any potential minefields through bombardment and ionic warheads certainly played a part in that calculation. In truth, the assault already achieved its primary objective. It broke through the enemy's forward defenses, pinned down a large number of their forces, and allowed multiple Special Forces units to slip in and go hunting the Separatist shield generators. With those down, the waiting acclimators could prove decisive. RK equals Part 2 RK equals Coronet City, Corellia, a sergeant. Ahsoka blinked at the young woman, who was just a few years older than her. That was who her people managed to scrounge as a ranking Corellian officer in the whole area. Oh, there were many more Corellians in the region. Their shattered units had dug in around the ever-shrinking pocket of territory holding the civilians. However, most of those were now little more than isolated strongholds, controlling the approaches to the dubious safe sector behind them with what little firepower they had left. There was nothing like a proper continuous defense line. If the Separatists wanted the Corellian positions overran, they could have done it weeks ago. There was no need to kill your bait. Doing so was counterproductive when there was a bigger quarry you wanted to catch. A quarry like Ahsoka's regiment and all the brave fools who made the drop with her. "Colonel, sir." The shell-shocked local mumbled through bleeding lips. Most of her face was a huge bruise in the shape of a metal hand. "I need a situation report, Sergeant. We need to hold this position until further reinforcements can fight their way to us. To do that, I need to know what I'm working with." Ahsoka spoke slowly and soothingly, drawing on her Jedi training. Something told her that trying a drill sergeant routine would be a spectacularly bad idea. "There were 2 companies of us holding the plaza when your attack began." The sergeant spoke in a thick Corellian accent, making her words a bit hard to understand. "The Tin Men hit us with everything they could as soon as you began landing. If they persisted with the assault, I'm sure none of us would be here. One moment they were about to overrun us, then, there were no more Tin Men trying to kill us all." The sergeant looked around with unfocused eyes. "Not that there are many of us left to kill now. As for command, a commando unit struck the Major's CP. There were no survivors. I honestly can't tell you who else is left alive, or who is supposed to be in overall command of this disaster of a siege. Our last general bolted about 2 weeks ago, and it has been downhill from there." "Medic, see to the sergeant." Ahsoka nodded in thanks to the exhausted soldier and shouted, "Someone, get me a count of the combat-capable defenders left in this sector. Any engineers still alive, reinforce remaining defensive positions and get us what mines we've got on the obvious approaches." Ahsoka rattled a string of orders. They all could hear and feel it. The rest of the GAR was coming, and the sound of combat was ever-present thunder drowning everything else in the distance. Countless flashes lit up what passed for a horizon in this desolate hell of a city. If the droids had a say in the matter, they would be regrouping and preparing for a final assault against the cut-off units, before reinforcements could reach them. That done, they could concentrate on inflicting as many casualties on Kenobi's soldiers as they could. "Colonel, we've got movement beyond the perimeter. It reads as small droid clusters, scouting elements I reckon." That was one of the Durst tankers, who was on overwatch thanks to his machine sensors. Even with the jamming, they were still good at short range. So much for getting a breather and properly reforming her ragtag command. Ahsoka silently cursed the clankers and went back to doing her job. "Time's running out. Get all the wounded at a secure position and hunker down. We'll hold here," Ahsoka declared. "I want sharpshooter up those buildings, on the double." The tanker was right. What hit them a couple of minutes later were probes, squad-sized droid groups, often led by a commando, that had its chassis repaired with whatever spare parts it could find. These things were smart. There was nothing in the way of the usual wave assault tactics preferred by the Separatists. They weren't trying to drown the defenders in numbers. Instead, they probed forward carefully, used suppressive fire to cover each other, and the various units supported those around them. It was more like looking at groups of clones doing the same than a Separatist operation. That, Ahsoka decided, didn't bode well for the war at large. Quality had been the Republic's greatest advantage to date, yet with all the green formations hitting the front, it was going to take a sharp hit. If at the same time, the quality of the enemy raised sharply, then that was a recipe for a bloodbath. The reconnaissance in force was painful enough for Ahsoka's survivors, even though they prevailed with only suffering light casualties thanks to an advantage in firepower. The tanks were particularly helpful in that regard. They were going to be the enemy's primary targets, and as soon as the droid scouts were no more, Ahsoka hollered to the engineers to get them dug in. They did it quickly and loudly, using some of their precious remaining explosives. A work party quickly gathered to add twisted durasteel and other odds and ends as makeshift ablative armor. Colonel, a soldier in armor missing most of its ablative layer, reported. Our scouts made contact with more locals on the left flank. He pressed a few buttons on the computer built into his armor's vambrace and it displayed a small holographic map. There's what's left of a platoon anchoring our flank here. 2 buildings blinked from neutral gray to friendly green. That's the good news. The bad one is that as far as they know, they're in that sector. There's no one else between them and the civvies. What reserves they had, they lost them trying to reinforce what's now our position. They never made it. It took Ahsoka long moments to digest the information, and even longer to recognize the man delivering it. I thought no one else of the senior staff made it. For the first time since this disaster of an operation began, a genuinely friendly smile blossomed on Ahsoka's face. They certainly tried to make it so, Colonel. Major Grayson gruffly replied. He was brand new to the rank, like almost everyone in the regiment after they got cannibalized for experienced officers. He was even newer to the duties of intelligence officer for the whole unit. Grayson got the job thanks to his experience in leading Anaxian Ranger Reckon's elements in his misspent youth. That by itself said volumes for how starved for cadre the GAR was. I managed to link up with some of our scouts, and then we followed the noise of the fiercest fighting. I'm assuming that those scouts found our new friends? Ahsoka nodded at the map between them. They sure did, sir. We linked up just as you arrived. I hope it wasn't too presumptuous of me to ensure we wouldn't be surprised again, before properly reporting my arrival? Not by me, Major. I need you to. Colonel, we've got heavy movement across the perimeter. I think this is it, the Durst tanker reported. And we're out of time. Major Grayson, you have tactical command. I'll need to focus on my space magic, as the boys put it. This is going to be an all-hands-on-deck exercise. The bastards sure don't waste any time, do they? I'll do my best, sir. May the Force be with you. Don't die on me, Grayson. Too many good people did already. Ahsoka ordered and turned around, to walk towards the center of the plaza. Her survivors ran for cover, while a few brave engineers fussed around the tank's dugouts. There were about 200 and a change here, and Ahsoka would be pleasantly surprised to learn that she didn't command the largest concentration of survivors from her regiment. They were all her people, her responsibility. She felt their eagerness to serve, to prove themselves, and protect a republic that didn't deserve them. And she got most of them killed. That thought infuriated the young Togruta, and she used that emotion as fuel to kindle a raging inferno. The Force flowed freely, trembling in excitement. Somewhere close, a familiar presence burned within it. That was Obi-Wan. Ahsoka immediately recognized him. Whatever he was doing, it was major for her to feel it this clear for kilometers away. The sound of combat rumbling above Coronet's ravaged remains rose to a crescendo. The GAR was throwing everything it could against the enemy, yet they weren't breaking through fast enough. Or at all. There was just Ahsoka, standing between a wall of deadly metal and her precious few survivors, her pack. She snarled wordlessly. Rage flowed into ancient instincts feeding them, only to be fed in turn. All the while, thanks to Zash's damned teachings, Ahsoka managed to keep her reasoning. She could feel the anger, pain, despair, and hopes of a whole world, and they were more fuel for the furnace. All the suffering since the Separatists' invasion in the whole system fed the dark side, and now it was eager to come out and play. Ahsoka went for that power willingly, knowing the price, and the dark side joyfully responded in kind. The colonel walked behind the forward-most tank dug into the plaza, acting as bait for the enemy. Sharpshooters opened fire, and the droids responded in kind, while most of them tried their best to keep to cover during their advance. A separatist tank element slowly made its way into view, and immediately opened fire, engaging the DOS machines. Ahsoka paid it no heed. She raised her hands in the air, as Zash taught her, like the infernal woman showed her through the Force. Just like so many Sith sorcerers of old. Unnatural lighting cracked over her fingers, ignoring the armored gloves she wore, or what was left of them anyway. Tendrils of lightning exploded from her palms, striking the ground and grounding Ahsoka. The pressure of the power she unleashed, even as the dark side happily gave her all she asked for, and more, was enough to raise her off her feet, suspending her in midair. The sky darkened, and the temperature around Ahsoka rapidly fell. There was energy in the air, a tremendous amount of it. It came both from the endless fighting all over the city, and the powerful shields trapping them within Coronet. That was even more fuel for Ahsoka to work with. That was more fuel than her body could handle, more than she would ever need that day. It was still there, hers for the taking. The droid's assault began in earnest, and Ahsoka dropped as much raw power as she could on them. Lighting bolts that had more in common with particle beams than anything natural struck down, illuminating whole districts with their hellish light. Thunderclaps shook people and machines off their feet alike. The strikes kept raining down, becoming more vicious and powerful. More and more lighting bolts forked where they struck. Chain lighting exploding from the impact points and impacting multiple droids to leave only smoking hulks full with slagged components. The enemy tanks were no exception. Lighting fell from the black sky to strike them again and again until it was a sole torrent of power that drove them into the ground while burning through deflectors and armored alloy. A tank blew up, its power stores and munitions cooking off, followed by a second and a third. Stirred up by the unleashed power, the wind howled around and through the ravaged building, like the cries of countless damned souls. Ahsoka collapsed to her knees, hitting the ground hard, panting for breath. The power, there was so much power flowing through her, surrounding and beckoning her to continue. It was right here, ready for the taking. The things she could do with it. The vengeance she could wreak to the enemy. If that is what you wish, I will welcome you as my apprentice. We can do great things together. My last apprentice is the living proof of that. Zash's words echoed within Ahsoka's head, and she felt a chill slice through whatever little warmth was left in her exhausted body. At that moment, the young Togruta didn't know if she would refuse Zash if given the opportunity, or embrace it. All she knew for sure was that this was true power, and with it, Ahsoka might just be able to preserve what was left of her people. Tainted Liberation =RK=. Part 3 =RK=. Coronet City, Corellia. So, this was what being at the entrance of the Corellian Hells felt like. Kenobi must. Smoke and dust cut down the visibility to practically nothing, only to glow hellishly with every weapon release in the vicinity. Droids converged on their position from three sides, with everyone firing everything they've got into the billowing heavy-on-metal soup that was the air. Between the smoke rounds, burning wrecks, and blasters melting what they struck, Obi-Wan didn't want to think about what would happen to anyone unlucky enough to be outside without a respirator. People like the scattered pockets of civilians who didn't make it to the cut-off forces at the center of the city. The visibility was terrible, which was a feature. The droids focusing on Kenobi's command was a feature too, kind of. How they did it, on the other hand, was anything but typical. I say again, they're using a wave charge as a cover for heavy weapons teams sneaking upon us. Watch out for them. We've got infiltrators approaching the perimeter. They're bouncing from cover to cover and using the attack as a distraction to come in closer. Those were among many of the filtered reports that reached Obi-Wan so he would know what was coming at him. Instead of using his eyes, Obi-Wan used the Force to observe the avenue down the road. That allowed him to at least partially disregard the choking clouds of smoke cutting down visibility and degrading sensors alike. This will have to do, Kenobi muttered to himself. He switched his communicator on the General Command channel. Banshee 1, we've got your firing position secured. Deploy forward and open fire on the previously discussed map grid as soon as you're in effective range. Be advised, you'll be firing blind. Now they just had to hold this position for the next few minutes. What followed would have been deadly stumbling in the dark if it wasn't for the force. Blaster bolts and missiles came tearing their way through the smoke, which was already glowing from all the energy constantly discharged within it. The metallic filaments meant to mess up with sensors heated up and burned, illuminating indistinct shapes dashing through hell. Grenades flew in all directions. Hot metal scythed through GAR positions, only to be often deflected by rapidly deteriorating armor. The same was true for the droids. The lighter models were simply unable to survive in this environment save for luck. In the same regard, any lightly armored troops thrown into the fray wouldn't survive for long. This was the kind of warfare Obi-Wan hadn't imagined even in his darkest nightmares, yet now he presided over it. He did so in theory anyway. From his forward position, Obi-Wan was unable to effectively command this part of the battle, much less the whole assault. His purpose was different, and he hated it, primarily because it left him too much capacity to think and feel. The constant terror, violent deaths, and the agony of the wounded washed over him in a constant stream of stimulation. Soon, something stirred deep within the city, and the dark side answered. It crashed down like a diseased frozen river, choking down the light and feeding on all the suffering and terror. All the distraction Obi-Wan got was deflecting the odd blaster bolt that came too close to comfort or push away the next barrage of missiles. From time to time, he would notice a larger group of droids making their way forward unmolested. Kenobi would do his best to either direct fire their way or throw something suitably heavy with the Force to ruin their day. Most of the time, he was stuck as little more than the ordinary grunts, feeling alone, even if surrounded by allies. The bone-chilling effects of the dark side seeping through fully isolated armors didn't help things either. A familiar, yet not, presence flared in power. Despite the distance, it had the distinct sense of Ahsoka, yet the dark side clung to it as if it was perfectly at home there. The Force stirred, the telltale sign of a major work underway. Soon, the disturbances were too much, robbing Obi-Wan of the ability to perceive anything but a churning storm through the Force. Distant thunder hammered down, its echoes reverberating throughout the whole city. Forked tongues of pure power lanced down from the sky in the distance, potent enough to be almost clearly visible throughout the smoke. Force storm, Obi-Wan's mind supplied. He had read about it in the archives when researching Veil, and more recently, Zash. It was an ability of the Sith sorcerers of old. Of those Sith alive nowadays, only Veil and Zash should have been able to pull off something like this. To think that Ahsoka had the power for it, not to mention the training. What did that damn woman do to the young Tano? The lightning storm was violent enough to make the droid's assault falter briefly, buying the Republic soldiers a sorely needed brief respite. It was just enough to drag the wounded back, resupply with fresh ammunition, and rush in more reinforcements. More importantly, a modified artillery emplacement finally made its way to the bulge. Obi-Wan couldn't have timed it better if he tried. The lightning storm just ceased, plunging the whole battlefield in a moment of stunned silence, when a blinding ray of power flashed above the GAR positions. The specially modified particle beam merely warmed up the air with only a tiny fraction of the energy is delivered to the target, which was its key selling point. Under most circumstances, delivering that amount of energy to a target would have devastating side effects on and around the path of the shot. Thanks to some technological marvel of containment, the direct fire artillery favored by the GAR didn't have such an obvious drawback. A beam of pure energy potent enough to cut through modern warship armor had no trouble slicing through buildings. 2 5-second shots accounted for 2 of the skyscrapers turned into fortresses by the enemy blocking the way. While Obi-Wan couldn't see their collapse due to the billowing smoke. However, everyone could hear the wail of collapsing durasteel and the almighty deafening crash that followed. Small, dull explosions followed when minefields detonated while being buried by tons of metal. After a few more buildings received the same treatment, there would be little in the form of direct enemy resistance to stop them from reaching Ahsoka and the besieged locals. If the droids wanted to stop them, they would have to come out from their strong points and meet them in the open among the rubble. All units, advance. The reinforcements are to form up on our flanks. Obi-Wan ordered. The artillery platform needed to survive just a few more minutes and it would be able to finish up clearing the way. Kenobi was going to ensure it had the time, even if it killed him. Heavy tanks and IFVs surged forward, followed by assault infantry. The momentum was shifting, Obi-Wan could feel it. If they could maintain it and link up, then they would have achieved their primary objective. Doing so would almost make the price in blood worth it. RK equals Part 4 RK equals Coronet City, Corellia. For the Republic Special Forces deployed on Corellia, the titanic clash of armies laying waste to the capital was little more than a useful distraction. Squads of cloaked soldiers wearing some of the best armor money could buy used the chaos caused by the Gar assault to infiltrate in squad strength through the front lines. When they passed by the directly contested zones, they had to carefully sneak through the fighting. Those who made it without running afoul of unfriendly fire had to often crawl from cover to cover in order to avoid droid units racing to reinforce various defensive zones. Those machines were in a hurry. They lacked the time, inclination, and more importantly, experience, to pay heed to the odd atmospheric disruption that might signify a cloaked commando skulking around. Instead, if they paid those signs any thought, the droids would have chalked it off to odd phenomena caused by all the nasty contaminants and energy choking down the atmosphere. That was a fatal mistake, which allowed multiple commando units to avoid contact and begin searching for their critical targets. Not all infiltration squads were that lucky. The cloaks of a few troopers would flicker at the wrong time and place due to the heavy smoke, right when one of the smarter droids looked straight at their position. The results were almost universally deadly. Of the discovered units that decided to stand their ground, or had no choice but to do so, a single lucky squad survived long enough for friendly forces to break through to the position they hunkered down, an abandoned and emptied gun store, which had reinforced walls. Most detected squads spread out, with the compromised troopers trying to lead the enemy away from their cloaked comrades. It even worked a few times, allowing isolated fire teams to continue their mission, while the rest of the squad ran for their lives. In all the chaos raging throughout Coronet, it was a scout unit detached from the DERS Heavy Armored Division, who got lucky in the end. There were only 4 of them left by the time the scouts reached their target, a worse-for-wear warehouse complex that shone on their scanners with power emissions off the charts. The other half of the reconnaissance squad had to lead away a group of commando droids who noticed them due to a malfunctioning stealth field. The remaining scouts huddled on the 5th floor of a nearby empty residential building, trying to decide how to proceed. "There's a lot of metal protecting that place," Sergeant Brosu pointed out. They could see at least a company worth of droids holding a perimeter around their closest side of the warehouse. The machines did their best to stay concealed. That was likely in order not to give away the importance of the building they guarded. "Drax, how much demo do we have left?" he asked the unit's demolitions expert. "Enough to leave a couple of city blocks. We're packing the good stuff for this exercise." "How close does need to be to the shield generator, or its power source to knock them out for good?" "Very close. Those things are made to take punishment. We aren't looking at a mobile system stripped of as much secondary systems to reduce weight." "It's going to be a one-way trip, Max," the sharpshooter concluded. "If the reactors go up, we'll waste the surrounding districts anyway. Unless we can get in and out unnoticed, then there's no reason to bother trying to get away. If the metal doesn't take us out, the explosion will. Then, there's all the other metal we'll be pissing off by removing their top cover." Drax shrugged. "Perhaps we should wait for reinforcements?" the last scout, Rhino, asked. "If they aren't here yet, we can't be sure they'll make it in time, or at all," Brosu decided. "Max, you're on top cover. I, along with our optimist here," the sergeant patted Rhino's chest plate, "will create a distraction. Drax, you're going in and making sure that shield goes down no matter what. Now here's how we're going to do it. RK equals. The mission turning into a one-way jaunt behind enemy lions greatly simplified things, Drax decided. It was shame he wouldn't be there for the liberation of Duro, Then again, if it was going to be anywhere as bad as this operation, he wasn't sure if this wasn't some kind of twisted blessings by the gods he stopped believing in a long time ago. While that tough old bastard Brosu and the rest of the squad discussed how to best get themselves killed to buy him time, Drax was busy rigging all his explosives ready to blow up, along with a Deathman switch. All he had to do was get close enough to the target, and at that point it wouldn't matter if the droids located and shot him. He wasn't sure how he felt about that, though at least it was going to be quick and painless. The same couldn't necessarily be said for the rest of the people he had been training and fighting for a few months now. To Brosu's credit, he might be a wheezed old geezer, but he didn't even blink at suggesting they were all about to die for other people's mistakes. To be fair, every volunteer in the new DARS units had to be ready to do precisely that, including the mistakes of their homeworld's government, who left Duro not sufficiently defended due to policies going back generations. It was both heartening and sad that there were soldiers in the division who hadn't been born, much less stepped foot on the homeworld, who eagerly enlisted if it meant they could aid in its liberation. As things stood, too many of them weren't going to live long enough to attempt liberating it to at least see Duro once with their own eyes. Drax kept working and tried to push those morbid thoughts aside. Those issues were nothing he could or should worry about now. All he could do for his people, fellow soldier and the Republic, was see to it that the damn shield went down. Besides that, there was only hoping that enough people in the Republic shared the sentiment and were willing to pay the price to see this crazy war fought to the end. There was nothing else to it really. He rigged the last detonator and double-checked that everything was in order. Only when Drax was certain he won't blow up by accident, he began working on the Deadman switch. That one was simple, the only hard part was splicing it into the armor's limited medical suite. "I'm ready," Drax walked back to the other scouts. He found them sitting on the ground in the corner of what used to be an office, and using pieces of furniture and debris to mock up the enemy positions outside. "Good. Judging by the sound, the rest of the army is throwing itself against the enemy, and that has to be a bloody affair," Brosu nodded at the demolitions expert. "We've got a plan that might get you close enough to guarantee the shield goes down." The plan was simple in the end, a diversion of a two-man team, who would ensure being discovered trying to sneak in, then create a ruckus that might give Drax better odds for a quiet insertion. An awkward exchange of farewells followed, and four ghosts headed for a meeting with Destiny.